Welcome back to St. Paul's Episcopal Church and to the 5th lecture in Newburyport's Road to Revolution series. We want to thank Bronson and St. Paul's for working with us to make this event happen. We also thank our board, volunteers, and you, our community, for continuing to enthusiastically support our programs and events. The events from now until the end of June that commemorate and celebrate the 250th anniversary of the start of the American Revolution, along with many other exciting events across the state, are sponsored by the Massachusetts Office of Travel and Tourism as a part of their Mass 250 campaign. We are very grateful to be one of the communities chosen to tell our revolutionary story. The grant that sponsors these events is a partnership with the Cushing House Museum, Lowell's Boat Shop, Newburyport Chamber of Commerce, North of Boston CVB, several churches, and every single one of you, so thank you. At the end of this video is a musket drill with members of the Acton Minutemen and His Majesty's 10th Regiment of Foot.
So now it is my great pleasure to introduce you to Joel Bohy. Joel is the Director of Historic Arms and Militaria at the Blackstone Valley Auctions and a frequent appraiser of arms and militaria on the PBS series Antiques Roadshow. His latest book is Bullet Strikes from the First Day of the American Revolution, available wherever fine books are sold. Joel, take it away.
Thank you. I'm going to try and go through this. There's a lot of information here, and I jam-packed it in, and it's documents that talk about the start of the revolution, as well as objects, and then there's some objects that have really cool stories, so I kind of have to talk about those stories a little bit for each one, because if I didn't, it would be really dumb, because you'd be missing out on some really cool things. So I might veer a little bit, but I'll bring it back. So anyway, we're going to get started with the fact that Minutemen were not new in 1774. The first document I've found is August 12th, 1645, and there is a order from the General Court that out of 100 men in a militia company, 30 were to be pulled out and be able to march at a half an hour's notice, fully armed and equipped. And so we think of the Minutemen of late 74 and early 75 as being this new thing, but it was not. In order to understand what happened in late 74 and 75, you have to look back into the 17th and early to mid 18th century, because Massachusetts had prepared for war numerous times. The only thing in 1774 was they were preparing for war against their own king. So that's a big thing. I'm not downplaying that. But many of the men who were working on supplies, stores for the army, were people who had done it for the king during the French and Indian War. So they had been down this road and done it so many times that they basically were able to pull this together. But we need to start September 1st, which I don't have on this slide, but the powder alarm. It was before the Provincial Congress actually formed, but armed men actually did march towards Charlestown, now Somerville, where Gage had sent troops to take the powder out of the house and bring it back to Boston. And it infuriated a bunch of people, and militias actually formed and marched there, which was a huge deal. But there was no governing body at that time. September 28th, 1774, Governor Gage declares his intention for the General Court not to meet on October 5th at Salem and discharges the Assembly. October 5th, 1774, members meet at Salem and organize, and the Provincial Congress is formed on October 7th, 1774. And from there, things start to ramp up really fast. Now, on October 26th, 27th, they form a committee of safety and supply. They start taking stock of what stores they had from the province prior to their forming the Provincial Congress. And they figure out that they've only got 250 muskets in stores, which is not a lot of guns. And they decide that they're going to start collecting money from the tax money that's not being given to the royal tax people in Boston, and start purchasing supplies for themselves to build an army. And one of the things they vote on October 29th, 1774, is which drill manual they're going to use. Because they had been using the Norfolk discipline up until this point, and they decide that an easier manual of arms to use is recommended for the inhabitants of this province that in order to their perfecting themselves in the military art, they proceed in the method ordered by His Majesty in the year 1764, it being the opinion of this Congress and best calculated for appearance and defense. And here is a Newburyport printing of that manual carried by Captain Nathaniel Gage of Bradford. Really rare manual, and to have one identified to a guy from Essex County is, I think, pretty cool. The Provincial Congress recommended on December 10th, the improvement of the militia in general and the art military has been therefore thought necessary and strongly recommended by this Congress. We now think that particular care should be taken by the towns and districts in this colony that each of the Minutemen, not already provided therewith, should be immediately equipped with an effective firearm, bayonet, pouch, knapsack, 30 rounds of cartridges and balls. Soon after, the Continental Congress also issues a recommendation, and I know you can't read that, so I'm blowing it up a little bit here, that they are to use their utmost endeavors to make themselves masters of the military exercise, that each man be provided with a well-fixed firelock and bayonet, half a pound of powder, 2 pounds of lead, and a cartridge box or powder horn, and a bag for ball, and be in the readiness to act on any emergency. So they're trying to get these guys fully armed and equipped for war. There are also town militia resolves for militia and Minutemen. Town of Roxbury then voted that they hold themselves in readiness at a minute's warning, complete with arms and ammunition, that is to say, a good and sufficient firelock, a bayonet, 30 rounds of powder and ball, pouch, and a knapsack. The town of Braintree calls for a good firelock, bayonet, cartouche box, 1 pound of powder, 24 balls to fit their guns, 12 flints, and a knapsack. And Arthur Harris of the Bridgewater Militia recorded in his journal the rules that they had. Each soldier to provide himself with a good firearm, a steel or iron ramrod instead of wood, a spring to hold that ramrod in place, worm priming wire and brush, bayonet fixed to his gun, a scabbard and belt therefore, a cutting sword or tomahawk or hatchet, and those were to be if you didn't have a bayonet that fit your gun. You could use a cutting sword or a tomahawk. A pouch containing a cartridge box that will hold 15 rounds of cartridges at least, 100 buckshot, jackknife, and tow, they spelled it two, but tow for wadding, 6 flints, 1 pound of powder, 40 leaden balls fitted to the gun, a knapsack and blanket, a canteen or wood bottle to hold 1 quart. Now, in the town of Concord, they formed their first Minute Company on January 17th, 1775. And they mustered on the Common in Concord, right in front of the Colonial Inn, if you've ever been there. And they were reviewing the 50 men that had joined Captain Charles Miles' Minute Company. And they realized they needed a committee to look at how they were armed and equipped. And so it turns out they had Captain Jonas Haywood and Colonel James Barrett, who were in charge of the supplies that were being moved to Concord, Samuel Whitney, Deacon Thomas Barrett, and Lieutenant David Brown, who would later become captain of another company. And they reported that there were 15 persons out of the 50 that did not have a gun in the Minute Company. Now, how do you cure that? Each town had a stock of arms that they paid for and ammunition. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. But one of the things that I want to make clear is everybody seems to think that every male inhabitant of Massachusetts, everyone had a firearm, and that's just not the case. There were some people that couldn't afford one or couldn't find one, so the towns would supply those men with guns. Again, on January 27th, Concord had decided they were going to form a second Minute Company under Captain John Buttrick, later major at the North Bridge fight. And this is one of the calls to his men that was sent out. Really rare document. That they were to fall out with arms complete for training day. So that was to be on January 30th, and we know that happened because the actual original muster roll survives, and it lists all of the men that were in that company. So they actually formed another company of 49, including officers. On February 14, 1775, the Provincial Congress recommended reviews of all of the companies in Massachusetts. So they were to form their men, they were to inspect all of them and see how they were armed and equipped, and send returns in to the government of all the arms, bayonets, equipment that they had, including their town stocks of arms, so that the government, the Provincial Congress, could know how many arms there were and how well prepared they were for war. Now, General Gage knew exactly what was going on. He had spies just like the provincials did, so he had a great idea of what they were doing, where stores were. He knew for the most part some of the houses in Concord and other places where the stores were and what was there. But he writes a letter to Gage, to Lord Dartmouth, talking about what was going on in Massachusetts on March 4th. And he goes through, they have 20 artillery companies with 2 guns each formed. They're making tents, they're buying shovels, bill hooks, other supplies for an army after the war began. And he also writes, each man is supplied even to a knapsack, canteen, and blanket, and directed to bring a week's provisions with him when called into the field. So even Gage knew that these companies were preparing and were ready to march at a moment's notice. And to kind of put all these things together, we're going to look at, I had this painting commissioned by Don Troiani, this figure study, so that you can see how they were roughly equipped. This particular individual carries a civilian hunting piece, a fowling gun. It's not adapted to fit a bayonet. So on his left hip, you can see the tip of his cutting sword. He's got a whisk and brush hanging from his cartridge box on the right side, a knapsack for his provisions, a canteen or wooden bottle to hold 1 quart, and he's got a leather tump line with a blanket rolled up in it. So back to the February 14th order of the Provincial Congress, where they asked for all those returns for each company to be turned in. All of the returns were turned in, but they don't survive anymore. They were either vanished, got destroyed somehow. People have been looking for them since the 1830s, and they haven't found them. However, there's some that have appeared, and we'll go through a couple of them. But here we have Concord's muster on March 13th, and this is again Captain Nathan Barrett from Concord's militia companies calling out his men for this muster. And we also know it happened because Reverend William Emerson, who lived in the old manse next to the North Bridge, recorded in his diary the exact sermon that he gave to all these forces that were there, and talked about all the men in town forming and marching. Now, Western Mass was a little bit different than Eastern Mass as far as having enough supplies and money to be able to arm and equip their men. This particular return is Shutesbury. Now, these ended up in a private collection through the Porter family, got passed down for generations, ended up on the West Coast, and Historic Deerfield tracked them down and purchased them for their collection. So there's a series of about 8 or 10 returns from Western Mass, which I had never seen before, which give us a view into that part of the state. And you can see here they had 33 guns in order, 2 out of order, 13 pounds of powder, which isn't enough for a pound for each man, 399 bullets, 72 flints, 4 bayonets, and 2 knapsacks. And he writes at the bottom of this document that it is not possible for us to procure arms in session by reason of the severity of money and our severe circumstances being poor. So they just don't have the money to buy guns. Now, Salem was a different story. Salem posted their muster in the newspaper on March 7th, and they wrote, "Every person liable by law to train muster upon an alarm belonging to the militia of this town have been warned to appear in School Street at 9 o'clock in the morning on Tuesday next with arms, ammunition, and accoutrements. It is hoped that every friend of his country, every man who has a respect for that recommendation of the Provincial Congress or regards the safety of his life, liberty, and property, will prepare himself to defend them against every invader, and appear thus prepared in School Street at the time above mentioned. The proper arms, etc., for a foot soldier are a well-fixed firelock and bayonet, a pouch that will hold 20 or 30 rounds of cartridge, half a dozen flints, 30 rounds of cartridges with ball, or a pound of powder and 30 balls, a knapsack, a screwdriver, and priming wire. And it wasn't until a few months ago that I realized or heard from a friend that he thought the Pickering papers had those returns for the Salem companies. And I've got all the returns, but there was an overall return in there, which I'm going to try and blow up, and I know it's hard to read. But he's got the 6 companies from Salem. He's got a list of all of their firelocks, bayonets, swords, pouches, cartridge boxes, flints, cartridges, balls, powder, knapsacks, screwdriver, and priming wires. Now Salem's men, because Pickering was really into the art military, obviously produced great returns, very thorough returns, but they were also armed very well and equipped. The only thing they seemed to be lacking in at that time is priming wires, which is something that's very easy to make. Another return I found at the Sudbury Town Clerk's office was the overall return for Sudbury's companies, and I've tried to blow it up a little bit bigger so you can see it. The screen is great, but it's hard with documents to make it so everybody can read it, plus the 18th century handwriting is a pain to read. The first company at the top, Captain Moses Stone, he has 92 men in his company. 18 of them don't have guns. The next company down, Captain Aaron Haynes, he's pretty well equipped, and he says that he has 60 men well provided. Captain Joseph Smith's company is not well equipped. They have 75 men with 15 without guns. And then Captain Isaac Locker has 21 men besides what are on the minute roll well equipped. So Sudbury has 2 companies that are badly equipped and 2 that are really well equipped. And going through the Mass Archives documents for years, I ended up finding Captain Aaron Haynes' return at the end of a volume of documents that had been donated in the late 19th century. And he says on March 22nd, 1775, to the gentlemen field officers of this regiment, there are, in compliance to advice of Congress and your requests, a return of the number and equipness, I love that word, of the company of militia under my care. Men 60, well provided with firearms. Most of them have either a sword, bayonet, or hatchets, about 1/3 of them with cartridge boxes. So the 2/3 that don't have cartridge boxes have a powder horn and a ball pouch. Another return that I ended up tracking down was at Old Colony Historical Museum, who we talked about earlier, who have a gun similar to Long Tom. And they had this document from Colonel John Daggett's militia companies. And he lists all of his men, 47 equipped according to law, 5 bayonets. 58 according to law, 55 are equipped according to law, 20 with bayonets. So there's a lot of variation even within a town as to how many have bayonets, how many are well equipped, and how many aren't. Now the deficiencies in those men was to be taken up by the men themselves to buy these things, or borrow them, or to get them from town stocks. So Concord voted on September 26, 1774, to buy 420 pounds of powder, 500 pounds of ball, in addition to the town stock of ammunition, a chest of good firearms, that those who are unable to purchase them themselves may have the advantage of them if necessity calls for it. And we know that some of those were issued out based upon those 15 men on January 27th. Lunenburg voted to purchase 60 firearms with bayonets for the use of the town, with 57 cartridge boxes. Westboro, who has a 2-page document that's wonderful with all the misspellings, and in case there is or shall be a poor person in said company that cannot provide himself with arms and ammunition as the law directs, that he do immediately make the same known to the town, and in order that the town may be more effectually provided with arms and ammunition, we recommend the following: that the committee chosen last fall to provide the town with 10 half barrels of powder and be directed to immediately procure the same, and also get as soon as possible 12 firearms with bayonets. I love that spelling. Now, we're also required to pay for their own powder. So this is a document from Concord for Levi Hosmer, and he took took powder from the town stock on March 4th, and he was going to pay for it out of his wages as a Minuteman. So he was going to be paid, and they would take that amount out of it so that he was fully equipped. Westboro seemed to supply quite a bit of ammunition. This is just one page from Westboro's book for April 19th, 1775. And Alex Kane found this document doing some research for Westboro. And it's killer because for me, it lists the fact that some of these guys were getting a hatchet out of town stocks. And it lists that they received a half pound or a pound of powder. But it also lists the caliber of the balls that they're getting issued, which can tell us what type of arms they have. So some of them, it says 18 bullets of 17 to the pound. Now, 17 to the pound, I've converted it on the side, would be about 65 caliber. So that would be a musket bore gun. But there are others. We've got John Piper received a pound of powder, 4 flints, 30 bullets, 30 to the pound. And 30 to the pound would be about 54 caliber. So he's carrying more than likely a civilian fowling piece. And the list is great because it gives us all this information that I had never seen before. Now, Sudbury issued powder and ball on April 19th, but they didn't specify the ammunition. They just said 20 bullets or 12 bullets. So we don't know exactly what the calibers were, but we know that Sudbury was providing not only powder and ball to their men, but there's a bunch of receipts for arms, muskets and bayonets that were loaned to their men to bring them up to par. And here's one of them that I have people that reach out to me all the time with crazy things they have. And out of the blue, I get emails from people like this guy who had this return from April 17th, 1775, from Ephraim Smith, has received of Jacob Reeves, as one of the selectmen of Sudbury, a gun and bayonet of the town stock, which I promised to return to the town if not lost in battle. So he had to return this gun after he was done using it. But what does survive from all these returns is the aggregate of warlike stores. On April 14th, you can see they talk about where they didn't receive returns from, which was basically Dukes in Nantucket. And the aggregate shows 21,549 firearms, 17,444 pounds of powder, 22,191 balls, 144,699 flints, 10,108 bayonets. So you can see that about half of the colony has bayonets for their guns. Now again, you can see from the other returns, every company is different. You have some with a lot of bayonets and you have some with only a few. But roughly half of the guns in the colony had bayonets or were fitted for bayonets. Now we're going to talk about some of the actual guns that were carried on the 19th. This is a civilian fowling piece that was owned by Robert Chaffin from Acton. And it's been cut back and adapted to fit a bayonet. You can see the bottom image. You can see that little nub on the bottom of the barrel. That's so that you can lock the bayonet on and it won't fall off. It's a spectacular gun, 55-inch barrel, so it's a really long piece. Here are 3 more examples of provincial arms. The top one, Roger Brown from Framingham, Mass., from the collection of the Concord Museum. It's kind of a cross between a hunting gun and musket, but it's still a small bore. Small bore is it's hard for people to think about that being a small bore, considering the guns we talk about today. But for the period, that was a fairly small bore, .60. And it would have fired a ball that was about .06 smaller. So it would have fired a ball of about a 55 caliber. The next piece is actually Captain John Parker of the Lexington Militia. This gun is in the collection of the state. It's been shortened in the 19th century, and it was donated by his grandson, Reverend Theodore Parker, to the Commonwealth upon his death. The gun at the bottom, Samuel Dakin from Lincoln, Mass., and that one has a really small bore of 50 caliber. The barrel was shortened on that one also in the 19th century to make it a little more, with that long barrel it can be very unwieldy when you're hunting, so the norm was in the 19th century to shorten the barrels. So they didn't have these long barrels to run around in the woods. Now there are also British comments on provincial arms. And by the way, those 2 musket balls are musket balls we found on archaeology projects at Minuteman. So those are April 19th balls. The top account came from Frederick Mackenzie of the 23rd Royal Welsh Fusiliers. These fellows were generally good marksmen, and many of them used long guns made for duck shooting. So those are the fowling pieces. And another account from an officer at Bunker Hill says their firelocks are very long, some near 7 feet. That's a tall gun. Now this article was in an English newspaper and was sent over and reprinted in December of 1774 in the Boston papers. And it states, besides the regular trained militia in New England, all the planters' sons and servants are taught to use the fowling piece from their youth, and generally fire single balls with great exactness at fowl or beast. A gentleman well acquainted with that country is confident the 4 provinces can muster upwards of 12,000 of these marksmen in 48 hours. Now, the people in England reading that must have been thinking, wow, that's kind of scary. I think the first section about their marksmanship is really overrated. The second part of how many men they can muster in a short amount of time, of 12,000, is an underrated number. We know now that about 23,000 were mustered in a few days. So that's pretty impressive. The gun down below, Captain David Brown from Concord, his house stood just on the west side of the North Bridge. So on the morning of April 19th, he was fighting in his own front yard. So there are all sorts of types of arms, not just hunting guns. There are guns assembled from parts, and we were at the museum talking about this earlier. This particular gun was carried by John Gordon from Stowe, who marched on April 19th and was mortally wounded at Bunker Hill. And it's got what looks to be an imported British barrel of a fairly small bore, .62, French lock, an early French lock, French side plate, French butt plate, trigger guard, and a maple stock that would have been made here. So this gun was using older parts and assembling them into a functional firearm. And this one, last Thursday, if I'd given the talk, I wouldn't have had this one because I forgot about it until Thursday night when I was going through my files and I went, oh yeah, this gun was from Newbury. And it was in the Museum of the American Revolution collection. And I emailed them that night, and this is like 9 o'clock at night, and they responded really quickly. So by 9:30, they had sent me high-resolution images of this gun, which I thought was fantastic because I wanted to include it. And this is another parts gun. It's got a much larger bore, .75, and barrel length of 48 inches. Again, it's a reused older barrel, and the lock is really early. The lock is probably about 1730. So, you know, they're building up a functional gun from older parts. The other types of guns that are being used are older French arms from the French and Indian War. And this particular newspaper article mentions Nathan Putnam, who was from Danvers. He was badly wounded in the right shoulder in Menotomy, or Arlington today, diagonally across the street from the Jason Russell House, if you've ever been there. So there's some really heavy fighting there. Anyway, he was of Captain Hutchinson's company, who was then badly wounded. A French firelock marked D number 6 with a marking iron on the breech. Said Putnam carried it to a crossroads near a mill. That's Cutter's Mill, like I said, across from Jason Russell House. Whoever has said gun in possession is desired to return it to Colonel Mansfield of Lynn or the Selectmen of Danvers, and they shall be rewarded for their trouble. And that gun was more than likely a model French model 1728 or 1717, similar to this example in the image. Many of these were captured during the French and Indian War, and they were sold in Boston. There are tons of newspaper articles with these things for sale. So you could buy chests of these muskets to issue them out to your militia, or you could buy them singly if you needed a gun. But I know that Nathan Putnam he didn't get his gun back, because I found the receipt for him being paid for his wound and his firelock and loss of time, and so he was paid on December 15th of 1775 for the loss of that gun. One of the biggest things that people get wrong about April 19th, and I see it in documentaries all the time, is that both sides were carrying the same guns. There were a few King's Arms that were carried, older King's Arms by militia and minute companies on the 19th, but not like they say, where everybody carried the same gun. The patterns of guns that were here had been sent over in 1755, and these were for the province stock. So if you were going off to fight and you didn't have a gun for the province, you couldn't get one from your town, they would issue you one which you had to return. And these I know from the documents in England, which this cropped image is, land muskets of the king's pattern with double bridle locks and wood rammers, bayonets with scabbards, musket slings of tan leather, cartridge boxes with straps and 12 holes, some halberds, and drums complete. Now those 2,000 guns that were shipped over are British pattern 1742 Longlands, like the one in this image. But these were to be turned back in to the province. But I found all the loss returns from the 1757-58 campaigns, and there was a lot of them that vanished. So there would have been some in the hands of people, and they probably could have purchased a few older guns, but the guns that most people are carrying today at reenactments are not the proper ones. They look good from a distance, but they're not the right guns that would have been here. So the other way we can find out more about the types of arms being carried is archaeology, like I mentioned. In this particular musket ball, we did a project last August for 3 weeks, and this is the first musket ball we found, and it was really important because I was teaching a couple of archaeologists how to use the metal detector, and they completely missed this slab of lead. And I went over with my machine, and I went, guys, you got to come back here and dig this up, because I knew what it was. And they dug, and it was a 79 caliber ball fired at high velocity. You can see the other side of it. Look at that blob of lead. I mean, that thing is huge. That was probably fired from an older 17th century gun, and it hit this rock and it landed right in front of it, where the flag is. So the ammunition also guides us as to some of the guns along with the documents and extant arms. And here's one of the balls that I found at Parker's Revenge. I don't know whether you guys heard that project. We did it in 2013 to 2015. And we found the spot where Captain John Parker's Lexington Militia, after Lexington Green, had marched towards Concord to get back in the fight and attack the British column. We knew roughly where it was, but it took us 2 years before we could actually find all the data in the ground. And it also told us what types of guns they're carrying, because we can look at those balls and figure the calibers and then extrapolate that into the arms. Here's another one from Parker's Revenge that hit at a medium velocity. You can see that funky sprue on the top. This one had also hit a rock and landed in front of it. And this document to me is one of the best as far as seeing what types of guns militia and minute companies are carrying on the 19th and early in the siege of Boston. And it's the number of bullets to a pound each gun carries in Captain Turner's company. And if you look on the left side, you see 12, 13, 14, 16, 18. So if the British muskets or larger bore guns are firing a .69 caliber ball, that would be 14 bullets to the pound. So if you look at the 14, the ones to the left of it are larger balls. But as you go to the right, you go to the 20, 22, 26, 28, 30, those are smaller balls and smaller bores. And if you look at that grouping of hash marks, those men are more than likely carrying fowling pieces. So there would have been more fowling pieces than muskets in that company. Now, bayonets is another thing that we should talk about with these, because, again, a lot of people think none of the militia had bayonets. They didn't need them. They were just rabble. It didn't matter. But that's not true. As a part of the 1758 Militia Act, half of the men in every foot company in Massachusetts had to have bayonets fitted to their guns. So that's a lot of guys that had to get bayonets. And the province would pay them back, but they had to submit a return to the province with exactly the names of the men, and then they would be paid for that amount for the bayonets. And here's Lexington's return. Lexington got 50 bayonets, so their company was around 100 men. And many of those men on that list were there on April 19th. Captain John Parker's on that, as are a few others who were wounded, badly wounded on April 19th. And on December 28, 1774, Lexington voted this time that bayonets be provided at the town's cost for 1/3 part of the training soldiers in the town, including those soldiers that already have had bayonets provided for them at the province charge. So those are the bayonets that they received actually in 1759, June of 1759, that last receipt. So they wanted 1/3 of the men in their bayonets. Now, this is one of my favorite bayonet documents from 1758-59, and it's for South Hadley, Massachusetts. And it's a letter basically saying, hey, we've only got 6 bayonets. for our company, and here's why. The bayonets appeared well and handsomely made, and the smith demands 6 shillings for each of them. But the guns being of different sizes, the smith grew discouraged in proceeding to make more. So the bores, there's so many different bore sizes because of all the guns, the variations in guns, that this particular blacksmith got sick of it and said, no, I'm not doing this anymore. I've had enough. 6 is enough, I'm done. So blacksmiths continued to fit bayonets to guns. I found this journal at work, or it's an account book of Nathaniel Dean from Raynham, Mass. And it listed all the blacksmithing work that he did for people in the town and surrounding towns. And I had to pick one. There's a bunch of great entries in there. But this one was for Joseph Haynes. And you can see the top listing is to setting a new shoe for you. So he's shoeing a horse for Mr. Haynes, and then to fixing a bayonet on a gun on April 4th. So he's adapting or fitting a bayonet to fit this guy's gun, and there's a bunch of listings like this in that account book. And there are also bayonets that were lost on April 19th. This particular one, Jonathan Smith is writing to the General Court in Massachusetts that to whom it may concern that I, the subscriber, lent a gun and bayonet, 3/4 pound of powder, 1 pound of ball, 1/2 pound of buckshot, 8 flints to Mr. Nathaniel Chamberlain of Needham. On the morning of the 19th of April last, said Chamberlain marched to Menotomy and engaged in the battle and lost his life there. So he was killed on the Jason Russell House property and lost all this stuff. And he's buried in the mass grave just down the street in Arlington. But Jonathan Smith put in his petition because he wanted to be paid for all those things that he loaned and never got back. Another guy from Needham, Nathan Newell, he lost a bayonet on April 19th too. The petition of Nathan Newell humbly showeth that on the 19th of April last at Menotomy, in the engagement with the ministerial troops, I lost a good bayonet which cost me 8 shillings. Your petitioner prays the General Court to make me such allowance for said bayonet as you and your wisdom shall think fit. So down at the bottom, they didn't think fit to pay him for the 8 shillings, they only paid him 6. There's a lot of them like that where they put in for a certain amount of money and then they go, no, we're not giving you that. We're not giving you that. But enough of bayonets, we got to get on to some powder horns. You ready for some powder horns, Steve? It'll keep you awake, hopefully. This particular powder horn was owned by Willard Buttrick. It's dated September 15th, 1774. Now, I was at my house drinking beer out on the deck one Sunday, and I got an email from the Park Service saying, hey, somebody wants to donate this horn. Is it real? And I pulled the pictures up on my phone and went, holy crap, I've known about this horn since I was a kid and never knew where it went. And it was still in the Buttrick family. And I had seen it originally in the book that had all the proceedings of the centennial in 1875. And there was a listing in there for some of the objects that were on display for President Ulysses S. Grant, who was there to see, and other visitors from the 19th. And it lists the sword of Lieutenant James Potter, the British Marines. That's not true. It was not his sword. It was from a grenadier of the 10th Regiment of Foot. A British cartridge box, stamped GR, taken from the regulars. That cartridge box was a British Light Infantry 9-round box worn around the waist that had been donated by Henry David Thoreau to the Concord Antiquarian Society, which was stolen in the 1970s. We're still trying to track it down. But then there's a powder horn inscribed Concord, William Buttrick, his horn, September 15th, 1774. Now, they spelled his name William instead of Willard, but that's his horn. The powder horn of Amos Barrett is in the Concord Museum collection. The sword of Captain Nathan Barrett is in the Concord Museum collection. And then there was a listing for a powder horn carried by Joseph Chaffin of Acton at Concord and during the chase to Charlestown Neck and at Bunker Hill. And I promised Steve I would throw some Acton stuff in here. So I've got a few cool things. And this horn, I didn't know where it was. In 2013, I was trying to track it down, and I'm a member of the American Society of Arms Collectors, and we had a tour in Lexington and Concord, and I gave tours of the battlefield, and then I took one of the collectors out for lunch and took him to Acton. And we had lunch at Not Your Average Joe's, and I showed him the Jonathan Hosmer house, and where my wife grew up was where Joseph Chaffin lived when he was alive. And we get all the way back to Sturbridge. I take him back, and He brings me into the collections room, and on his table is Joseph Chaffin's powder horn. So it was really, really cool. He never said a word, too, because I'm talking about this powder horn. He just sat there with his poker face on, never said anything. And then I get to the place, and there's Joseph Chaffin's horn on his table. And he had a huge laugh over that. But then we were able to get some high-resolution images of it, and it's now on loan to the Museum of the American Revolution. So it's in Philadelphia now for the anniversary. You can see it there. Really cool horn. One of the more poignant objects of April 19th, there's a couple of them we're going to talk about, there's this great letter from Jonathan Hosmer of Acton. And a friend of mine in Beverly Hills owns this. And he talks about at the beginning of the document how he's been really ill. He's been sick, and he was just able to go to meeting the day before on his birthday. And so he hadn't been to church, but this was a big deal for him that he could actually get out and get to church. And at the end, he talks about Robert Chaffin of Acton, Joseph Chaffin, who owned the powder horn before, his father dying from sickness that winter. But the important part is in the middle of this document. And it says, "As for news, we daily expect a tumult. There came up a post to Concord a Saturday which informs them that the regulars are coming up to Concord, and the next day. And if they come, I believe there will be bloody work." And what he didn't realize is 9 days later, his son Abner Hosmer would be killed at the North Bridge carrying this powder horn. But one of the things we noticed looking at this powder horn was on the stopper, which you can see up to your right, most of the time on original horns, that's gone. You see a violin key, or people put weird stuff in it. But this one had the original stopper, and it was marked JH. So more than likely, this horn had been Jonathan Hosmer's, and his son Abner was carrying it on the 19th when he was killed. And this was passed down through the family and donated to the Concord Museum. Another really poignant object from Acton, James Hayward. James Hayward had marched with one of the militia companies to Concord, was at the North Bridge fight, although with the militia companies, he was behind all the minute companies. The minute companies were in front. By the time they got to Fisk Hill, he had stopped there purportedly to get a drink from the well. And the first mention of this is on April 25th in the newspapers. Mr. James Howard, they always misspell the name, and one of the regulars discharged their pieces at the same instant, and each killed the other. So they purportedly ran into each other. Hayward was getting a drink from the well. They both fired. The British soldier fell dead on the front steps of the house, and Hayward was mortally wounded. But there was nobody there to witness it. But Rebecca Fisk, who was the daughter-in-law of the person who owned the house, she had taken her aging father-in-law away to safety, and after the fighting had passed, she came back. And she talks about the dead British soldier on her front step. She also talks about two other wounded British soldiers, and she stated the third was a young American employing his dying breath in prayer. A bullet had passed through his body, taking off in its course the lower part of his powder horn. The name of this youthful patriot was J. Haywood, she screws it up too, of Acton. His father came and carried his body home. It now lies in Acton Graveyard. Now in the 80s, I knew that this wonderful picture of Rebecca Fisk survived, but I didn't know where it was. It had been sold at auction by Michael Grogan, who I ended up working with on Antiques Roadshow. And all I had from him was a really grainy black and white picture, sell picture from the catalog. And you couldn't see the background of it. February, all of a sudden, the painting popped up at auction. And it had been in Concord the whole time, but I never found it. And the really cool thing about this painting is that it's a painting within a painting. And if you look in the upper corner, there's a depiction of Hayward and a British soldier shooting at each other with a well in the background. It's allegorical, but it's a great thing. This was so important in Rebecca Fisk's life that she had a painting of it in her home. And here's James Hayward's powder horn. You can see the round hole where the bullet entered. It's .70 caliber, so it's consistent with a British musket ball. And it blew out the other side. It blew out the original wood plug that was in it, and sent those shards into his body along with that 70 caliber ball. So it was a brutal, mortal wound. When he died, his father took the powder horn home. It went to his son, Stevens Hayward, then his son, Stevens Hayward, who put on the silver ring, the mahogany plug, and donated it to the town of Acton, where it is today in the back of the Memorial Library. So you can go visit it. If you're in Acton and you're near the library, their graves are across the street under the obelisk memorial, but the horn, along with a couple of items we're going to talk about in a little bit, are there on display. Really important object. Now, it wasn't just powder horns that were being used. This from the Essex Journal on March 11, 1775. I have great reason to think from the observations I have made that there is not a proper regard paid to the importance of having cartridges properly made with a ball in each. I would therefore strongly recommend it to my countrymen immediately to be provided each man able to bear arms with at least 20 well-made cartridges. Tolerably expert may with ease load and fire with cartridge 4 times in a minute, and I am positive that no one can charge once in that time any other way. I have no doubt but we shall be obliged to take the field in defense of our just rights and liberties in the spring. Therefore, I hope a proper attention will be paid to this hint from a true friend of his country. So, with a powder horn loading, you have to load the powder into a powder measure. Then you have to have a little bit of tow or wadding. You have to load the ball down, the muzzle of the gun, ram it home. With a paper cartridge, you pull it out of your cartridge box, which we're going to talk about in a minute. You bite the paper off, and you're going to see this later from these guys. I didn't mean to give you the finger. Then you would load the ball, which was smaller than the bore with the paper cartridge, ram it home. It was a lot faster to load paper cartridges. So they're trying to get everybody to carry cartridges, as many men as they can. Some towns issued cartridge boxes. January 23rd, 1775, the town of Hatfield, Captain Isaac Chapin received 33 cartridge boxes for his company. Concord voted, when they formed their companies, to give one as a bounty. So each man shall receive from the town a cartouche box for his encouragement. So they would be paid, but when they enlisted, they were given a cartridge box also. And we know that they got them because I found the receipt, May 22nd, 1770, the one right in the middle. Then paid Mr. Reuben Brown by an order to Mr. Bond, town treasurer, for 99 cartouche boxes. So we know the number of men that were in the company, and we know that they were issued prior to April 19th. But Reuben Brown's house was raided by the British on April 19th, and a lot of things were taken out of his house. Ladies' clothing, children's clothing, but they also raided his leather shop, and they burned a bunch of things and destroyed 12 cartridge boxes from his stock. Now, he was making more and more. They were trying to get as many people cartridge boxes as possible. Brown later supplied cartridge boxes to the siege, and by later I mean like a month or two later. He was making more cartridge boxes and sending them into the siege of Boston so we could get people equipped. Israel Litchfield was from Scituate, Massachusetts, and he left a fantastic journal where he talks about just about everything going on, including the manual of arms that they're using, when they switched from Norfolk to 1764. But he wrote about cartridge boxes he was making. On February 11th, in the forenoon, I went over to Mr. Wilcott's shop, and he and I made a center bit to bore a cartridge box. I bored off one box. On the 14th, I made me a cartridge box. I covered it with colt skin. It will carry 19 rounds. Captain Stockbridge bought a hide and a half of moose skin for cartouche boxes, cartouche box straps. It cost him 16 pounds, old tenor. And he wrought with Captain Stockbridge stamping covers, cutting covers out. And then another man was working on leathering them, putting them together. Then the next time he wrote about it, this day I wrought there making cartouche boxes. And on the 7th, same thing, made more cartridge boxes. Now, a friend of mine owns this cartridge box, which was from Elisha Gross. And Elisha Gross was in the same company as Israel Litchfield. And so when you look at this cartridge box, it's got 19 holes, it's got a hair-on flap, and the strap may be moose possibility that this cartridge box, still with some of its original cartridges, was made by Israel Litchfield, which makes it really super cool. This cartridge box block survives in the collection of Minuteman National Historical Park. It came out of what's now called the Wayside, right on what's now Lexington Road in Concord, just down the street from the Louisa May Alcott House. Nathaniel Hawthorne lived there for a while, Margaret Sidney. But this was found in one of the walls. Samuel Whitney was the muster master of the Concord Minutemen on April 19th, and it may have come from him. But it's got an addition, it's got 19 holes, but then in addition, when they gave an order for 24 cartridges, they just nailed another block with 5 rounds onto the front, stretched the leather pouch, and there you go. Another one a friend of mine owns is this one, which is marked Lexington. We don't have any other provenance or provenance to know whether it was actually there, but it's the same style, 19 holes, very similar and obviously incomplete, but still a cool piece. This box in the collection of Don Triani is 17 rounds, and it has a provenance of being carried at Bunker Hill. So there's the back. And then inside the block is the same form, but just with 17 rounds. And like everything else, there were cartridge boxes lost on April 19th also. This one, John Tidd. John Tidd was in Captain Parker's Lexington Militia Company, and he was wounded on the morning of the 19th on the Green. And he was paid for nursing the loss of his gun, cartridge box, and other accoutrements. Another guy on April 19th was Thomas Cumming from Needham, Mass. And he wrote, this may certify to whom it may concern that I, the subscriber, Thomas Cumming of Needham, was in the battle at Menotomy on the 19th of April and lost a cartridge box with 19 cartridges, so more than likely a 19-hole box, 12 spare balls, 6 flints, a turnkey, a brush, and wire, for which he was paid for. Now we get on to swords. One of Steve's favorites. He got to carry it on April 19th. A few years back when I was the chair of the celebrations committee in Concord, so I get to see it. This is the sword of Captain Isaac Davis, who was killed at the North Bridge on April 19th. And it's shorter than it originally was. Some say that when he fell, he landed on a stone wall next to the causeway and broke the tip of it off. There's a erroneously written document in the Acton Library that says that the blade was flipped around and reset. That's all crap. This is the way it originally was. Someone just filed down the tip at some point, but still a really cool and moving piece. And if you notice that form, see that small sword form? There's going to be a pattern here. Here are 4 other April 19th swords. The one on the left is a silver hilt that came into Antiques Roadshow in Sacramento, California, of all places, carried by a guy from Stoughton, Massachusetts, when he marched on April 19th. A silver hilt, really nicely made sword. The middle sword is Major John Buttrick, who commanded the troops at the North Bridge. The next sword is John Hayward of Acton. He was a lieutenant on April 19th. When Isaac Davis was killed, he was promoted to captain and took command of the company. And the next sword over is Captain Nathan Barrett of Concord, who commanded one of the militia companies. But you look at those forms, they're very dainty, more gentlemanly looking swords that most of the officers are carrying, except for this one. This is Lieutenant John Bacon of Needham. He was killed on the Jason Russell property on the 19th. And I had known about this sword for a long time. I had found newspaper listings and other listings for it in the 19th century and figured it was just lost like so many other things. And I was at a bar, believe it or not, in Baltimore, Maryland, at an American Society of Arms Collectors conference, and a guy comes up to me and he goes, "Hey, I hear you're into April 19th stuff." And I was like, "Yeah." He goes, "Well, I have this guy's sword, Lieutenant John Bacon of Needham, and I nearly peed my pants." It was unbelievable. I couldn't believe that he actually had the sword. And when I went to his house and saw the sword, it matched the documents that I had found in the 19th century, or from the 19th century. And I had also found this lost petition that was turned into the state by his family for his gun and other things that he lost on the 19th, but his sword isn't listed because it seems a family member had taken the sword with them when he was killed, but everything else they lost. They went back and tried to find his things, and he had already been buried in the mass grave down the street from the Jason Russell house. Another item that officers carried was a silk sash. And 18th century silk sashes are really, really rare. I have a few friends have them. I see them at a few museums. But this particular example was really, really cool. And my friend in Beverly Hills had it in a Ziploc baggie, and he chucks it at me and says, "Hey, take a look at this." So I open it up and I pull it out. I'm like, "Wow, that's Really cool 18th century officer sash. And you can see right up, kind of right up in the middle or just to the right, it's worn and frayed. And that's where it would have rubbed on his sword. But the cooler thing about this was who owned it. He handed me this letter next. And it says, Mrs. Hancock sends her kind love to Colonel Boyle and presents him with a military sash which belonged to Mr. Hancock. The services of Colonel Boyle as aide de camp to the governor for a number of years, having met his highest approbation, she flatters herself he will be grateful to possess so honorary a badge. She therefore begs his acceptance of it as a token of her regard and as a memento of her deceased friend and his commander-in-chief. John Boyle was John Hancock's aide prior to April 19th and through the entire war and after the war. So Dorothy Hancock, upon John Hancock's death, presented this to Colonel John Boyle, which is a really great item and really rare. So canteens, we talked about that, canteen or wooden bottle to hold 1 quart. This particular canteen is what I call a keg or keg style. It's made with individual staves and then 2 interlocking hoops to hold it together. This particular one had come right out of the Kemp family, which had moved to Maine after. And it's marked EK. You can see here's the other side, EK. And you can see those 2 interlocking hoops that hold it together. Really cool thing that ended up in Beverly Hills with the John Hancock sash. Here's another one carried by Joseph Elliott of Taunton, Mass. Same style of canteen. Later descendants carved initials and things on it like this. It got passed down through the Morse family before it ended up in private hands. But it's the same interlocking hoops style, but there was another one that is more important. And that's what collectors call the cheese box canteen. It's a very simple canteen, and a lot of collectors in the 60s and 70s believed that these didn't come out until the early 19th century. But here's a document from Massachusetts from March 14th, 1759, that states 1 wooden bottle would be issued to each man made with 1 hoop. That's what we call a cheese box canteen today. And here's the earliest dated example I could find. A friend owns, dated 1771, a couple of sets of initials on it. But you can see that single hoop. It's easier to make than a staved canteen. They could produce these a lot faster and cheaper. And it's the same style of canteen that was stored in Concord on April 19th. There were 15,000 of them in stores in Concord when the British went in, but the British never found them. They were just outside of town. But 15,000 of these canteens were ready to issue out to the Army. And they were all this style of cheese box. And here's one of them, marked RH 1775 on one side. And then on the other side, it's got the maker's stamp, and I think I figured out who he is. This canteen came to me at work one time, and I couldn't wait to see it. I ripped the box open. On all these canteens, I do an endoscope view and video and photographs. Sounds a little geeky, but I like to collect all that data. And this one, if you notice, where you would drink out of is elongated and chewed. And when I went to put the endoscope in, it had about 243 years of dead mice inside of it. So I had to go through with forceps and rubber gloves and a mask and pull all the mouse corpses out. Get the endoscope in. But it's in a private collection now, Don Triani's collection, but it's a killer canteen. And if you notice, see that little iron wire loop on the side? These were all slung with thin pieces of cording. They called them lines. So when they issued these out, they would issue out the canteen, and then you would get a section of line so that you could sling it over your shoulder. Here's another one that came out of those 15,000 canteens dated May 9th, Caleb White of Weymouth. Same style of canteen. See that drum and the single hoop. This one has obviously the iron wire loops also. And then knapsacks. This has been another thing, we've discussed knapsacks a lot, but there was some discrepancies. People thought that because a document said snapsack, it was something different than a knapsack. Fighting this for a long time and pulling up original dictionaries and saying, look, they mean the same thing. They're exactly the same. Oh no, it's got to be different. People overthinking things. But then fellow researcher John Reese was researching a guy from New Jersey who had come up to Massachusetts and had been fighting during the siege of Boston. And in this pension record from the 19th century, they talked about this, which is crazy. I learned at the time that Jacob had been out in the New England service among the Yankees, as we called them. Jacob called his knapsack Snapsack. We told him that it was knapsack. He said they called it Snapsack in the New England troops he had been with. So here's a guy corroborating it. Yeah, they just called it Snapsack, but it was the same thing. And the grave, the mass grave in Arlington, John Bacon, Nathaniel Chamberlain, and some of the other ones, they were all buried in that mass grave. And I found this note in the safety deposit box of the Arlington Unitarian Church. And it was from a subscriber to the monument that's there now in 1848. And he wrote, "A piece of cartridge box which belonged to one of the Americans who was killed with 11 others in the house of Jason Russell." Then he goes on to say, they were all buried in one common grave with their clothes and knapsacks on. So these guys were taken on a cart, brought to the burial ground, and put in with all of their equipment on them, including cartridge boxes. And what I had been looking for wasn't that document, but actually I wanted to find the objects that had come out of the grave in 1848. And here's a few of them: a piece of stocking, a tooth, a flint, a waistcoat size small button, and a piece of cartridge box. That were pulled out, that weird 19th century reasoning, like we're going to take things off of the bodies. It's just kind of creepy. This great document is Jonathan Jacobs of Royalston, Massachusetts, and they received the word on the morning of the 20th in Royalston. So Jonathan Jacobs is borrowing from Mr. Ebenezer Elliott of Royalston a gun, a bullet pouch and cartridge box, a knapsack, a powder horn, and it gives the value. And the reason for this was as a receipt, so that if he didn't get the stuff back, Jonathan Jacobs had to pay him. And Jonathan Jacobs got captured at Quebec with Benedict Arnold and lost all these things. So he ends up petitioning the state saying, "Hey, I lost all this stuff at Quebec. Can you pay this guy so I don't have to lose the money because I got captured?" Which ended up happening. Another knapsack, this is great. Captain Lemuel Pomeroy from Western Mass. This was in the newspapers. They lost 2 packs with a greatcoat, also a cartridge box and powder horn. The packs contained 2 white shirts, 1 check shirt, 2 pair of stockings, some provisions, etc., etc. Whoever shall take up the above and send them to Captain Stedman's of Cambridge shall be handsomely rewarded. And it's very likely the packs was by mistake put into the wrong wagon. So the guys from Western Mass that had a distance to travel hired wagons that they put their gear in to bring them east so they wouldn't kill themselves marching down the road. But somehow some of their stuff got put in the wrong wagons. And back to Timothy Pickering from Salem. In his easy plan of discipline for a militia, which wasn't accepted by Massachusetts until a year after April 19th, but he published it on February 18th, and he gives a description on how to make a knapsack. So there's another, there's not a lot of knapsacks that survive. So we've got this description on how it would be made. Like I said, there's very few that survive. This one, David Ull from New York, just made out of simple linen, a simple bag with a cross strap, which Pickering also mentioned that you should do to help support the pack when you're wearing it. There's another one identical to this that I found, and the guy wouldn't let me take pictures of it, and I have no idea where it is now. It's all up here until it goes away with the rest of my brain cells. And then this one, Elisha Gross's bearskin knapsack. So Elisha Gross, who owned the cartridge box, this was his bearskin knapsack. But knapsacks made out of hide were fairly rare in all the Bunker Hill lost petitions. They list knapsacks, tumplines to carry your blankets, all the cartridge boxes, all the things that are lost. And there's only one, and it's right about in the middle, that Daniel Mosier lost a goatskin knapsack and pocketbook. So he lost his wallet and a goatskin knapsack after the Battle of Bunker Hill. Henry Farwell of Groton, company commander, he lost 1 straight body coat, 1 blanket, and 1 tumpline to hold the blanket and wear it over his shoulder. Here are some more losses from Captain Benjamin Ames' company. And he shows the guns lost, the value of the guns, knapsacks, the value of the knapsacks, blankets, and there's a few cartridge boxes in there. And so to end, because I could go on all night and my wife will be falling asleep, I got to do a shameless plug for the book that I did, Bullet Strikes on the First Day of the American Revolution. I did it with archaeologist Dr. Douglas Scott, and we've gone through and we talk about arms, ammunition, barrels of guns, bores, and we record all the data from all the bullet strikes. So we went through the Jason Russell House in Arlington with ballistics rods and lasers, laid out where each shot came from, who fired it. James Hayward's horn from Acton is in there. We actually replicated that shot and shot a powder horn, which is in there. So I find it to be a fascinating book. Maybe you don't. But thank you very much. My leg's falling asleep. Does anybody have any questions?
Yes. How did they, my husband wants to know how they made the powder horns.
How they made a powder horn?
And out of what?
So they would take, when they would slaughter the cows, they would use everything. The leather, obviously, they would turn it into leather. They would take the horns, and then they would carve them down and make a spout end. And then they would heat the base and put a pine plug in, and then either use nails or wooden pegs to hold it in place. Carve a little stopper. But some are more ornate than others, and they would use files and such to shape the ends and carve little things into it. Some of them have ornate names and dates. But there were a lot of people back then who knew how to do this. And if you had carving skills in camp, who would make these horns up with designs on them, and they would leave the name blank, and then you would pay the person for the horn, and then they'd add your name and the date to it, so that you could go home with a really snazzy horn.
So are they hollow inside?
Yeah. The cow horns are all hollow.
You mentioned that in 1774 that they put out an inventory of the arms, and then also sought to provide additional arms. To get the count that they wanted. So the question is, who were they, and how do they communicate with each other before texting?
They are the Committee of Safety and the Committee of Supplies. There were committees made, just like in the church and everywhere else, that were to coordinate all this stuff. So they were to count up what they had in provincial stores, which I mentioned at the beginning wasn't much. And then they were to decide how many they needed, so they voted on 5,000 guns they wanted to try and acquire. And they would try to purchase them from dealers. They were also writing to people in Spain and France trying to get guns. So they were trying to acquire them, and they wanted people to make them. So they're trying to get as many people as possible to build guns from the older parts, like I mentioned, those parts guns, use up everything they had to make functional firearms for the soldiers.
They communicated with
Horseback. They had riders going everywhere.
Sorry?
Horseback. They had riders going everywhere, communicating with documents and letters back and forth. It's absolutely amazing what they were able to pull off without a cell phone, without a radio. On April 20th, there was a Council of War in Cambridge, and the first thing they voted on was getting supplies, provisions to feed the troops from Concord. By the 21st, they're issuing those provisions. So they're getting horseback riders to Concord, getting wagons loading stuff, and shipping it in and out of the siege very quickly, which again is absolutely amazing that they could pull it off in that day.
There must have been a huge wave of support to have this information received and acted upon.
Oh yeah, there's they were all prepared for this. I can only touch on a little bit of it, or we'd be here for a month. But they were really prepared for this. That's what they were doing. The whole reason for the Provincial Congress, Committee of Safety, Committee of Supplies, all the other committees, was to prepare for that moment when they would start they wouldn't start the war, the British would, but they would be prepared for that start. Now those supplies, those weren't to be issued out prior to April 19th. Those were supplies when the war broke out to issue to the troops. That would surge in.
So we were discussing the idea of different calibers and smaller calibers being used mainly as hunting rifles, but at the time with the cloth that people were wearing, the different calibers wouldn't be any less deadly, from my understanding, or am I missing something?
First of all, no rifles.
Okay.
Rifles were not.
Good point.
Yeah, rifles up here were not common. They weren't. I don't know. They just didn't seem to take, and they didn't like them. They start to come up with some of the riflemen who come up from Virginia and Philadelphia. But anyway, to your question, we've tested all this with representative examples of custom-made cloth, the coat, serge lining, waistcoat lining, linen on ballistics gelatin, and we fired all these guns at it. The fowling piece with a smaller bore, and we were talking about this at dinner, actually, believe it or not, has a higher velocity than the bigger muskets do. And that higher velocity ball goes right through 2 blocks of ballistics gelatin and the cloth with absolutely no problem. So yeah, it's the difference was, the British muskets were anywhere, and they all vary, there's a lot of variables, but 745 to maybe 1,000 feet per second. Whereas the fowling pieces, the shots were around 1,300 feet per second, 1,400 feet per second. This is a big difference.
Yeah, I guess the follow-up to that question would be, would the use of the larger caliber in military rifles, or not rifles, muskets, in military muskets, be a misunderstanding of the stopping power?
No, because what they want to do is they want to have a sturdy arm that a soldier isn't going to destroy, which is not a fowling piece, because they're too long, they're too thin. They want a sturdy gun that's not going to get destroyed, and they want to get as much lead downrange as possible and as big as they can. So that 69 caliber ball, when you get volleys of 69 caliber balls fired at you, and again, we've tested this. We've fired with British muskets, ballistics gelatin. We recreated the John Robbins wound on Lexington Green, where he was shot retreating in the back of the neck, came up, blew his jaw out. We replicated that shot with a ballistics gelatin dummy with bone simulant, and we've done all this stuff. So it's not. I don't think they realized the muzzle velocities because they didn't have chronographs and high-speed cameras like we have today to record all this data. They didn't know a lot of this stuff. They thought that putting 2 balls down the bore was a good thing. You're going to get more lead downrange, but it ruins the velocity. Your velocity actually drops tremendously if you put 2 balls in. So there's many things they didn't know then that we know now based upon modern technology. One more. Yep.
About how long would it take a gunsmith to manufacture one musket?
So that question, it depends on how you're doing it. So in other words, if you're at the Tower of London, you don't have one person making a gun. You have a series of people who are making barrels, locks, stocks, brasses, and then they're assembling them. Here, there's not a lot of people who are actually making the barrels and the locks. There are a few, but for the most part, they're just buying the parts and assembling them. So, it's going to take them a little while. They can assemble a gun probably in a week, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less. I mean, today when I have them built, it can take 2 years. But there are people that are, they don't do it every day like these people did at the time. So
just to follow up, if you were in the Tower of London and you counted all these different steps, how many hours or day and hours would it take to make
I'd have to sit down and try and calculate all that between, going through the listings of, barrels and what they had to do, because they made barrels from flat stock and welded it and then bored it and filed it. So there's a ton of work in each thing. I don't know exactly how long it took for each piece to be made and then to be assembled into the gun. I don't think anybody's ever recorded that. Yeah.
All right, so the last question is, what was your favorite thing at the Museum of Old Newbury?
Okay, there's a couple of things at the museum that were my favorites. There's a British pattern 1756 Longland there that was converted to percussion, but it's still a wicked cool gun. Long Tom was cool. That was cool. A couple of really good powder horns. Some cool swords. There's a lot of cool stuff there. Yeah, they got some cool stuff for sure.
Thank you so much. All right, if you would like to...
Fluorescent, and not going to pull that one out, but unless I absolutely have to. Does your flip work?
did earlier. I just wanted to tighten it.
Okay.
Leather stretches.
Okay. So we're going to demonstrate the musket drill that you heard about during the presentation just now, the 1764 Manual of Arms. It's the same manual of arms or musket drill that the British regular army was using, and it's the drill that all of the provincial militias were also using, and minute companies. So Paul and I are from a reenactor group out of Acton, Mass, called the Acton Minutemen. Helen here is from the 10th Regiment of Foot. Obviously, we are not on the same side. But we adhere to the same musket drill. So we should, even though we've never done this together, we should be able to get through this with some semblance of, I don't know, cohesion, I guess. But you can be the judge. So the reason any unit drills is so that they can become proficient in the different positions of the musket and the readiness of the musket. A commander wants to know that his unit members, men mostly, are going to be exactly the way he wants them to be at any given moment. So we are going to attempt to do that here. Rest your firelocks. And if there are any subtle differences between us and Ellen, it's because at times, which we have discovered in poring over these manuals, there are different, I don't know, people interpret the different commands and the different positions slightly differently from unit to unit. The idea in the British Army was to get everybody exactly on the same page. On the provincial side, everybody was in different towns. It's possible that there were some subtle differences in some of the maneuvers. Shoulder your firelock. Notice we try to stay in sync. Poise your firelock. Shoulder your firelock. Advance your firelock. Shoulder your firelock. Slope your firelock. There are different positions depending on what you're doing. If you're on the march, this is the normal position you'd be on, which is the shoulder position, but you need a break every now. You would never switch arms and carry it at shoulder on the right arm. That just wasn't part of the manual. So there are different positions that give certain muscle groups a break. And we can all tell you, these gain a pound for every mile you march. Erect your firelock. Trail your firelock. This position would be if we were about to go onto a trail or through the woods, or if we were running across a battlefield. And I can't tell you how many times we get out onto a battlefield and everybody starts to run, but the commander has forgotten to say the command, trail your firelock. So usually everybody just overrides them and does it anyway. Shoulder your firelocks. So those are the basic different positions that that we would carry the musket or put the musket in. If a unit is going by that we want to show some honor to, we would say, present your firelocks. So this is a position of honor. It's also the position that we go through on our way up and on our way down. So it has two names: rest your firelock or present your firelock. Shoulder your firelock. Hello. I think we will show you how they fire. Would you like to see that? Yes. The police have been notified. Quick. See if you see any spark there. Just a little bit. Okay, this thing sparks pretty good. I have a little pick here, and you can't see it, but there's a tiny little hole right here from this little concavity, which is called the pan, and inside the barrel. So there's a tiny little hole that goes through it. And when we load these, we're going to put a little bit of powder in the pan and put this thing down and trap it in. And later, when this comes forward and makes that spark, it ignites that. Oh, take care, Joel. It's on. All right. Thank you. I've shot a couple. All right. So you get the basics. Steel and flint make spark. Let's see. Let's fire toward the street. Let's have everybody move over that way. By the left wheel. March. Halt. So there are two ways that the muskets can be loaded. The commander can call it out by the numbers, which takes a while. We'll go through it once without loading, and then we'll live load. But just pretend for now. Prepare to prime and load. So we just drop the musket down. In here you can see we have some of those cartridges that Joel was talking about, paper cartridges that we each make at home. Open your pan, handle your cartridge. Tear it out. Huh? Not really. No, just tear it open. We would tear it open with our teeth and hold it up to our chin. That tells the commander you're ready. Prime. Pour a little bit in there. Shut your pan. Cast about. Charge with cartridge. Now the last thing that would go down will be a musket ball in the bottom of this paper cartridge. We obviously don't use that for reenacting or demonstrations, but that's the last thing. What he would also say is ram down cartridge, which we don't do in reenacting because there have been a few instances where ramrods go flying across the field because they get fired. Yeah. Shoulder go. Fire lock. Now, I've got this cartridge out. Now you'll see that it goes a little bit faster if we're allowed to go at our own pace. Prime and load. For real. Okay. I was going to say that was lightning fast. Shoulder. Fire lock. Make ready. Notice at this stage, we do not have our finger on the trigger. It's on the trigger guard. That's a safety standard that we adhere to. Would you do me a favor and just move over to the right? Thank you. We are going to fire where there are no people. Present. Fire. Prime and load. Shoulder. Make ready. Present. Fire.
Wow, I guess so.
The idea for any unit is to get your musket, all the muskets to go off simultaneously. Did that sound like a pretty good volley? Yeah. Both of them did to me, actually. Yeah. We'll do one more. Okay. 1 second. I think I need one of these, right? Prime man, load.
I mean, if I was watching TV right there and I looked out my window and saw that, I'm going right back in.
Got to be honest, this is black powder, and it's night. It's dark here. It's hard to actually see where, you know, when we're putting it in the pan. Incidentally, shoulder, fire locks. One way that the musket can misfire is if everything that's in the pan here goes off and you see the bright flash, but it doesn't go into the barrel and fire the gun off. That's called a flash in the pan. Make ready. Present. Fire. Sometimes you simply forget to cock the gun.
Wow. There you go.
Shoulder powder you're using. Fire lock. Open the pan. Secure your fire lock. We're just making sure there's no more powder left in there. Shoulder your fire lock. Let's by the right wheel. March. Yes, right. That way. That's that way. Call.
The other right.
Rest your fire locks. Order your fire locks. Are there any questions?
What's amazing is that more.
The powder you're using similar to the
Yes.
Is the powder similar to what they would have been using?
It's not any modern, imitation of it. What caliber are those?
What caliber are the guns?
75 caliber. This is actually a British brown bess that Joel was telling you the colonial militias would not have had.
Yeah.
This is actually what the British Army would have carried.
50 caliber is a half an inch?
Yes, so this is 3/4 of an inch inside this barrel.
This is a French musket. This is 69 caliber. So it would have taken a ball that's smaller than that. And she also has a brown vest. Right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. The weight of guns and like.
I'm sorry.